Welcome to the second program. So welcome to the second program in our Jewish Ethics series. I'm Susan Schwartz with Beth Israel Congregation over in Bloomsburg, and I'm really excited about tonight's topic, ethics in the environment. So during the pandemic, my congregation started meeting outside in the park because, the health department said that was safer. And at first it felt weird and I really missed our synagogue. But then there was that moment when we were all singing Oseh Shalom and the fireflies started twinkling in the background. And I really felt closer to God. And when we were as I was preparing for this talk tonight, I realized that that's a very Jewish reaction. Our people have always found holiness outside. God spoke to us from burning bushes and on top of mountains. We even have an entire holiday devoted to celebrating the outdoors. Tu B'Shvat was yesterday. And so in honor of that holiday, the birthday of the trees, the 15 congregations that are all part of the Central Pennsylvania Small Congregations Initiative have put together a terrific program. So, before we get started, I did want to say thank you to the Jewish Community Foundation of Central Pennsylvania and also to the Jewish Community Legacy Project, because they're the ones that brought all of our congregations together. This is the sort of program that a small congregation like mine could never do on its own, and we're really happy to be able to present this to everybody. So a few housekeeping items. This program will be recorded, and it's going to be posted on the Jewish Community Legacy Project YouTube channel. Everybody should be muted except for our speakers. If somehow you become unmuted, hit mute yourself. Otherwise, your pet or your spouse is going to do something really embarrassing at the worst possible moment. And I'm speaking from experience. So we as a people love questions. So if you have any, ask them in the chat. Rebecca is going to be collecting all of the questions. We're going to pass them on to our speakers, and we're going to do our best to get to them before the end of the program. If we're not able to, because we promised we would keep it to just 1 hour, they'll be answered, our speakers will answer it, and we'll get the messages back to you. So now about our speakers. Our keynote speaker tonight is Rabbi Ellen Bernstein. She's a renowned scholar and a passionate advocate for the environment. She's written several books, including Ecology and the Jewish Spirit, The Splendor of the Creation, and an environmental Passover Haggadah, The Promise of the Land. She created the first ecologically centered Tu B'Shvat Seder in 1988, and she helps turn the holiday into a community-wide interspiritual ecological arts celebration for all peoples. She still writes and she teaches about the ecology of the Hebrew Bible, and she serves on the advisory board of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. There's so much about her. There's an entire website devoted to it, to her. You can find her books and you can read more about her at www.ellenbernstein.org. But here's my favorite bit. Ellen is the founder of Shomrei Adamah, the Keepers of the Earth, the very first national Jewish environmental organization. Now, after her presentation, she'll be talking with Rabbi Nina Mandel, the spiritual leader of Congregation Bethel in Sunbury, just downriver from me. She teaches, Rabbi Nina Mandel teaches how to connect traditional Jewish values to contemporary issues, both locally and nationally. And we're also going to be hearing from Dr. Paul Washington of Beth Yehuda Congregation in Lock Haven. He has a PhD in geology, and he's worked in the environmental industry, both for companies and as a regulator. So, welcome, Ellen. And I've been wanting to ask you, why was it important to form a Jewish environmental organization?
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Before we get started, I just noticed in the chat that someone said they couldn't open the text that I sent. So I just hope someone can take care of that. Okay, back to your question. Why was it important to start a Jewish environmental organization? Is that your question? Well, I founded Shomrei Adamah in 1988. And I, at the time, there were very few religious environmental organizations. And I didn't have much of a Jewish background at all. But I grew up very a nature kid and very interested in the environment. I started studying environmental studies at UC Berkeley, one of the first environment programs in the country. And I was always looking for a way to connect spiritually with the environmental studies I was doing. And so I started looking into Judaism and seeing if there was a way for me to connect. I was born Jewish, but I didn't have a lot of background. And I looked for 5 years to see if I could find a Jewish environmental organization, and there wasn't one. And I always believed that if we wanted to take care of the earth, the best way to mobilize, or one really important way to mobilize, is by mobilizing people of faith. And given that I was Jewish, I wanted my tradition to be involved. And I felt like Jews were so good around social justice issues. And I had started studying with a friend. I had started studying the Bible with a friend and seeing all of this ecological stuff in it. And it was like, it just seemed so obvious that there ought to be a Jewish environmental organization. But not only that, I felt like as myself, as someone who had been kind of alienated from Judaism growing up, I felt like this was an amazing way to reach young Jews. So it seemed like a strategic thing for the established community, Jewish community, to want to follow up with.
I'm really glad that you did. And so I understand you have some information for us about how the Torah actually addresses environmental issues.
Well, what I'm going to be doing today is, because it's Tu B'Shvat, or it's actually Tu B'Shvat's just over, but we wanted to connect this program to Tu B'Shvat. And so one of the things that I thought that I could do was look at one of the texts that we're told to study on Tu B'Shvat. So basically, Tu B'Shvat is the Jewish New Year of the trees. It's this wonderful holiday. And the Kabbalists of Sfat had written a Seder, an orderly document, ritual for Tu B'Shvat. And one of the things that they did was they suggested various readings for this holiday. And one of the readings is Genesis 1, our creation story. So for that reason, I thought that I wanted to teach some of the ecological wisdom that's available to us in Genesis 1. So it's really a text study, and we're going to go slowly through the text, and I'm hoping that people have it now. Can we get a thumbs up if people do have it? Are people, it's supposedly in the chat.
I shared it in the chat. If you can find it, it's in the chat. If you can't, please message me and I will send it to you.
Okay, it's not absolutely critical, but for those of you who prefer reading and marking up a document as I go along, it's going to be easier. Otherwise, you can just listen and see what comes across orally. And as we said, that you can put your questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them. Okay, so let me begin. My interest in Judaism, and ecology was stoked as a college student when I was taught in my environmental studies classes that the Bible was in part responsible for the environmental crisis. Many environmentalists, we're talking about in the 1970s, many environmentalists, fired up by a famous article that was written in 1967 on the historical roots of the ecological crisis, pointed to the Bible, to Genesis 1:28, as the culprit for our environmental problems. They said that when God gave us dominion over the earth and all the creatures in Genesis 1:28, God is giving us permission, maybe even encouraging us to control and exploit nature. Don't worry, we'll be coming back to explore this idea in a lot more detail later. But at this time, I had very little Jewish background, and I really didn't know much about the Bible. And so I assumed that what my professors were teaching me was correct. But the question of humanity's dominion over the creatures stuck with me, and I thought I'd better take a closer look at the Bible myself to see what it really might be saying about our relationship to the natural world. This began my research into and fascination with our creation story, Genesis 1. Ultimately, I realized that contrary to what I had been taught, Genesis 1 actually offers a profound ecological message. So what I'm going to do with you tonight is present a few ecological ideas that I've discovered in the text. And then towards the end, we'll look more closely at this whole idea of dominion and humanity's dominion over the creatures and the earth and what that means exactly. So I'm going to start with day 3, and you can just listen along as I read from these texts and be listening for repeated words to get a sense of what might be important to the biblical author, or you can also follow along on your sheet. So we're starting with day 3, the third day of creation. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear." And God called the dry land earth, and God called the gathering together of the waters seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout sprouts, grass seeding seed, and fruit tree making fruit after its kinds with seeds in it upon the earth." And it was so. And God brought forth grass, herb seeding seed after its kind, and tree making fruit with its own seed after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and morning, a third day. So for those of you who might not be familiar with this creation story, each day a different aspect of creation comes forth. And so I'll just be looking at 3 of the days. So on the third day, which we just read, in Genesis 1:11, God proclaims, "Let the earth sprout sprouts." The 12th century rabbinic commentator Nachmanides notes that the Hebrew word for earth, or aretz, suggests a force that causes growth. God does not create by divine fiat here. God calls on the earth to express its own essence, to do what earth does best, that is, to grow all of the creatures. The earth has agency here. She is co-creator, alive in some way. Thousands of years before the scientist James Hansen popularized the Gaia hypothesis in 1972, this idea, which understands that the earth and all of her biological systems are one majestic, interconnected living organism, the Bible assumed the aliveness of earth. This is significant today because we rarely recognize the aliveness of the earth, and that's one reason for the dire environmental predicament we find ourselves in. Assuming earth is spiritless, inert stuff, we endlessly exploit and pollute her with no thought of the consequences of our action. Another ecological thread running through the third day is the idea of sustainability. If you take a look at Genesis 1:11 to 12, you will notice that the word for seeds, or zera, is repeated over and over again. The word zera in various forms occurs 6 times in these 2 verses, telling us to pay attention to this word. Seeds are significant. The herbs will seed seeds, and fruit tree will make fruit with seeds in them. The seeds are the most critical part of the plant. Without seeds, there would be no plants, no life. This is the message of day 3. Genesis 1 is not concerned with the other parts of the plant, not the leaves, not the stems, not the roots. It hones in on seeds, the part of the plant that will ensure a future for itself and the rest of us. So this idea of sustainability is also communicated in Genesis 1, our creation story, through the whole concept of blessing. I'm going to read now from day 5. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarming living souls, and let flyers fly above the earth in the expanse of the sky." And God created the sea monster and every living soul that creeps wherewith the waters swarmed after its kind, and every winged creature after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and fill the waters in the seas, and let the winged creatures multiply on the land." And there was evening and morning, a 5th day. Most people assume that the first blessing in the Bible is given to people, but it is not. It is given to the swimming and flying creatures. On the 5th day, the fish and birds are created, and they receive the very first blessing. Thousands of years ago, the rabbis noted that even though fish could reproduce on their own, they would need a blessing in order to create enough progeny to fulfill their mandate to fill up the seas. The blessing would ensure that fish would be able to reproduce enough of their kind to survive the hazards of their daily environment. Some would be eaten, some would die from disease, and some would drift into threatening surroundings. Mackerel, for example, lay millions of eggs, yet for each million, only 1 to 10 survive. With the energy of the blessing, the creatures would become so abundant that they'd be able to maintain their populations in the face of everyday threats and still provide food for all who are hungry. Biologist Cal DeWitt calls this first blessing the fruitfulness principle, a most profound biblical articulation of the modern day idea of sustainability. Perhaps the most obvious ecological idea in Genesis 1 is that of the goodness of each creation. In this story, every aspect of the creation is designated tov, or good. The light is good, the water, air, and earth are good, the trees and vegetation are good, the stars and planets are good, the fish and birds are good, and the land animals are good. In Genesis 1, the goodness of the wild and biodiverse world is a preeminent value. The rabbi, philosopher, and physician Maimonides, writing in the 12th century, said that the goodness of all the creatures is a testament to their intrinsic value. Each organism has integrity, each contributes to the whole and is required for the whole. The world is built on the foundation of the goodness of the creatures, without which it could not exist. The theme of the goodness of creation culminates on the 6th day, when the very goodness of everything is realized. Take a quick look at verse 31. And God saw everything that God had made, and behold, it was very good. Each individual creation was called good, and now the entire creation, everything all together, is deemed very good. The repetition of the 2-letter word kol, or everything, appears 7 times in verses 29 to 31, evincing the importance of all the creatures, every single one. There's a sense of indivisibility of all the creatures, interdependent, involved as one living, breathing whole. Every organism bound up in the life of every other organism. Modern commentators and many readers of the text have long presumed that the designation of very goodness on the 6th day refers to the human creatures who were created on this day. They assume that humanity was the crown of creation and that creation was established solely for people to use for their own benefit. Such an assumption leads to a utilitarian and anthropocentric stance towards the creation. Curiously, human creatures, unlike all the animals, do not even receive the designation of good. From the beginning, the biblical author was circumspect about humanity. Indeed, the Midrash teaches that God consulted with the angels to determine whether or not to even create human beings. There's way more that I can say about Genesis 1's ecological vocabulary, but I want to make sure to leave discussion for the dominion aspect of Genesis 1:28. So let me read now from day 6, starting at verse 26. And God said, "Let us make Adam, the human creature, in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the winged creatures of the heaven, and over the cattle and the whole earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And God created the human in God's own image. In the image of God, God created it. Male and female, God created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill, replenish the earth and master it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the winged creatures of the heavens, and over every living thing that creeps on the earth." God said, "Behold, I have given to you every herb yielding seed that is upon the entire earth, and every tree that has seed yielding fruit, it shall be yours for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, whereas there is a living soul, every green herb for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that God had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and morning the 6th day. When humanity was created last after all the rest, God gives us mastery over the earth and dominion over the creatures. As I mentioned at the outset of my talk, many have read this verse to mean that God gave humanity a mandate to dominate and exploit nature. This idea continues to be taught in environmental studies and geography courses today. And it's not just an issue in academia. Many ecologically oriented rabbis I know would like to expunge this verse from the Bible. I've always asked those who want to dismiss this verse, why, if you read the context of this chapter as we've been reading, why would God want to give humanity a mandate to exploit nature after God worked so intentionally to create such a good and beautiful world, a world that could sustain itself on its own in perpetuity without any help from people? I could never see how dominion here meant exploitation. I felt that most people who are castigating Genesis 1:28 were taking this verse out of context. They had no appreciation for what the rest of Genesis 1 was teaching us. The theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes poignantly about the meaning of dominion. He said, quote, the ground and the animals over which I have dominion constitute the world in which I live, without which I cease to be." Created last, the human creature is vulnerable and depends on all the other creatures in order to survive. Bonhoeffer continues, "In my whole being, in my creatureliness, I belong wholly to this world. It bears me, it nurtures me, it holds me. It is my world, my earth, over which I rule." But Bonhoeffer uses the word "my" here, not in terms of possession, but "my" in terms of relationship and in terms of belonging. He is reflecting the sentiment of the Bible, where there is not even a concept of human ownership. Rather, dominion implies a deep connection, a communion with nature. The Bible itself hints that dominion is not given to people arbitrarily. Dominion is conditional. It is given and can be taken away. The Hebrew word for dominion, the verb radah, points to this conditionality. In certain grammatical forms, radah looks exactly like another Hebrew word, yarad, which means to go down. Rashi, the foremost medieval rabbinic commentator, points to the wordplay inherent in this three-letter root and explains, if we consciously embody God's image, if we stand up and rule responsibly with wisdom and compassion, we will, radah, have dominion over the creatures, ensuring a world of harmony. But if we deny our responsibility to the creation and thoughtlessly take advantage of our position and the creation, we will yarad, go down below the other creatures and bring ruin to ourselves and the world. If we upend the blessing to further selfish goals, the blessing becomes a curse. It's upon us to choose. The most depressing thing to me about this ongoing debate about the meaning of dominion is that, interpreted correctly, in my opinion, dominion means to lovingly care for the earth. God's very first directive to us is to have dominion, to care for the earth. I believe that the many environmental studies professors and clergy who see it otherwise are deflating and denigrating what could be the Bible's most potent ecological mandate. I just want to add a little more context to our exploration, and I'll wrap it up in a minute or two. To add even a bit more context, dominion is bestowed to us as part of a blessing. The blessing in verse 128 is for both fruitfulness and dominion. It reads, "And God blessed them and said, 'Be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over.'" This blessing lays the foundation for the two basic necessities of life. Fruitfulness promises generativity of the body, and dominion, via the human creature's benevolent rule, promises the generativity of the earth and its creature. Barrenness of body and barrenness of land, or famine, would be the greatest threats to the Israelite people, while fruitfulness in both realms would be the greatest promise that God could give. So immediately after God grants dominion to the human creature, if you take a look at Genesis 1:29, God assigns the seed plants for food for the human creature and leafy greens for the animals. Dominion then ensures that both people and animals can eat and survive. Notably, dominion over animals doesn't include the right to eat them. Finally, it's critical to remember that the true crown of creation in our creation story is not humanity and our work of dominion, but rather the Sabbath, which is created on the seventh day. The Sabbath, the day of rest, is one of the Bible's deepest environmental ideas and practices. On Shabbat, we, along with all the other creatures, are called to recognize our creatureliness, our earthliness, and refrain from the using nature and simply rest in creation, content in the deep peace of an interdependent universe. While during the rest of the week we're called to work, Shabbat is reserved for simply being and celebrating the delight of creation. A day of rest built into the fabric of the week can become a profound environmental practice. The idea of one day off a week has been promoted by environmentalists the world over, who believe that if we fast from driving and using electrical appliances one day a week, we will naturally learn to cultivate a greater respect for creation. So for the moment, I've concluded this whirlwind tour of the creation story. I hope I've provided a little window into the importance of this text as the basis for a biblical environmental imperative.
That was beautiful. I wish James Watt had consulted with you before he took office. Boy, Nina, I was after hearing this, one of the things that really struck me is how did we end up going away, do you think, from that sort of attitude about the environment and about the world? Why do you think that we ended up going away from living in, from trying to take care of the earth into feeling like it had to be more, that we had to dominate it more? And how might we be able to go back?
So I want to reference actually something that I read in preparation for tonight, which was something that Ellen wrote about the challenge of talking about environmentalism and the challenge of talking about sort of Judaism and why some Jews have a hard time seeing themselves as environmentalists. So I can sort of insufficiently recap what I learned from that quick reading, in that I was struck by this idea of the shying away from paganism. So in the Jewish tradition, the sense that the sense of monotheism and the sense of we privilege the relationship between humans and God. I mean, that's what we tell those stories most passionately, most often, most in depth, those kinds of stories, which sets up this binary of there is the human experience, and then there is the experience that's related to nature, which in pagan traditions, that is a primary part of the worship of the divine, of the creator. So I wonder if if that becomes part of the distinction between the monotheism of the early Israelites, and then we pick it up. It gets picked up not just by Jews, obviously, but by Christians. It becomes part of the sort of the Western civilizational dogma about the preeminence of the human experience and the privilege of the relationship between God and human beings. So we get to this point where it's like, of course we can tame nature. I mean, I was thinking about that today as I was thinking about floods, because I live on a river that floods, and that I always have some sense of like cheering for the river when it floods. Like, see, we thought we were in control, but actually we are not. So I think maybe that's that's a thread that I would follow. How do we get it back is a major shift in how the paradigm in which we talk about these things, our relationship with nature, our relationship with God, how comfortable we are talking about that relationship with our relationship with our creator, and our interdependence on all the other created things, created also by the same source. One of the things that really struck me about Ellen's talk just now was the thinking and contemplating the difference between blessing and command. So yivarech or tziva, like God blesses, and in both of these texts, God blesses the animal, the fish, and says, you shall be fruitful and multiply. That's a blessing, right? And also when it's said to the humans, it's also said in the context of being a blessing. Yet we talk about it for the humans as a command, so that we are doing God's bidding, or we are obligated to do it in a certain way, as opposed to, a blessing which provides us sort of the relationship, the relational part of it, that openness. So I having just thought of this, I'm not fully developed in that thought, but I'm going to leave it there, because I want to ponder more that idea of what is the difference. How does a blessing become a command, and how does that change the intentionality of the blessing when we make it into a into that commandment.
Sorry.
Susan, can I respond for a
Oh,
second?
yeah, sure, of course.
So thank you so much, Nina. I'm really glad you picked up on that first part about what happened, like why why we don't take the creation material so seriously. And it's a huge historical problem. And basically, this is why I focus so much on the creation story in Genesis 1. And what I really believe is that basically you have Genesis 1 creation story and Genesis 2 another creation story. And I believe that those ideas kind of like go underground like tree roots, and then they pop up in different places in the Bible. And that's why I feel like it's so important to follow the language, so that you see that, as we rabbis know, right, that right, the whole story about the Mishkan, about building the Mishkan in the desert, right? When we do that, what that's supposed to be is we're recreating the creation, right? But there's stuff like that all through the Bible. Like there's aspects of the Exodus story, the plagues. The plagues are all an undoing of the original creation. If you go through and look at the language, you see what's happening there. And I just want to say one more thing about that, which is this other scholar that I'm reading talks about Pharaoh as the anti-creator. That's right. Pharaoh, like, what does he do? He kills all the baby boys, right? Anti-creation. And then you have all these plagues, right? So anyway, it's just, but very, I don't know anyone else doing the kind of work that I'm doing in terms of like really trying to trace these ideas and show that this is actually a substantial idea in Judaism, and something that we need to take really seriously, and not just, me come into your congregation and tell you, oh, do these environmental things. No, it arises from the text. And it ought to, like, for me, I want people to be inspired on their own and find how they themselves can contribute to what's going on in the world now in their own individual ways.
Thank you. Paul, I was wondering, I mean, what you've actually tried to work with companies, both, as part of, as a company employee, trying to get them to do the right thing.
Which is often almost impossible.
As well as the regulator, and kind of hitting it from another angle. What do you think about all of this? Well,
I look at this this whole issue of the environment from a more of a physical environment. The Jews, the Hebrews were living in a marginal environment, near a semi-arid environment that had specific moist areas that you could actually grow crops in, and other areas that didn't. And it varied over time. Through that period, you had the drought that the drought that caused the famine that sent them to Egypt. But even after that, the Philistines came in to the Gaza area at a point at the beginning of a drought phase they were driven in. They were part of the sea peoples of the 1200 era, and they came in probably from the area of Greece or thereabouts, the Aegean, and settled there. And they became a competitor for the resources in a period of famine, drought that was 300 years long. This is the type of environment that we're seeing the development of this text. So we're talking about, because the text was developed by people living in this environment. Yes, you may say it's inspired, but it's still written down by people who are living in this environment. So they're They have to be using their environment, but they also have to be managing their environment. And dominion over gives you the ability to manage. It doesn't mean exploit unconditionally, it means to manage. So they are managing their environment for their own survival, for the survival of their people, and for the survival of their people in contact with other peoples that are not necessarily friendly.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. The other thing that kind of struck me also is the old idea that the king is the land and the land is the king. I mean, a good ruler takes care of takes care of his or her realm, and if the
A
realm
good ruler, and historically there have been very few of those. Many of them started off as that and became less and less that as they became more and more drunk with their power.
Do any of our speakers feel, it kind of feels like maybe that's where we are now, that humans have become maybe more so drunk with their power, they are abusing the world that.
We have many examples through history of societies killing themselves off, such as the Maya, such as I'm thinking actually of the Cambodians, the Khmer did themselves in environmentally. There are a number of these through history that have overexploited their environment and have suffered the consequences.
I guess I would hesitate to, although I believe in people being drunk with power, not that I have ever been, but sort of blaming, blaming things on that. I think it's part of a bigger issue of how we talk about and how we understand our relationship. It's those who become successful and seem to be leading the charge in destruction are able to do so because the world is supporting that, right? Because there is an overarching paradigm that supports that. And so I think that, I so appreciate both Paul, bringing in this kind of historical, geographical context of how were the Israelites likely experiencing the environment in which they are relaying these stories that ultimately become text, and then the work that Ellen's doing in terms of looking at the language, because remember the word dominion is not in the Hebrew, right? The word in the Hebrew is in Hebrew. The translation of the Hebrew becomes ultimately this word that we have as dominion, and all of the implications that go along with that, the point at which the text, the Torah text, the Bible text gets translated from, Latin to Greek to German to English in King James, and King James' idea of what it means to be over something, dominion, that King James from that era, it is so deeply embedded that, certainly the drunk with power isn't helping, but, it would be easier to counteract this if this were just about one person's breed or one group's breed.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just always go back to Adam and Eve and how, the first thing they did was take from the tree. It didn't belong to them. So I just feel like we've been doing that. We've been transgressing boundaries. It's kind of like this internal human disposition, right? That we've been dealing with since the beginning, and it feels like a human issue that to me, that's why I feel like religions are so important, because that's what Judaism teaches us is how to deal with this kind of stuff, right? Anyway, go ahead, Paul.
Oh,
I was going to say that having lived around in many parts of this country, places where there is a low population density or where there are isolated high population densities surrounded by huge amounts of space, people have a much different view of what that of the need to protect that surrounding environment as compared to those who are living in the much more urbanized east of where we are now. When I was in Utah, yes, they talk about the Mormons talk about bringing the desert to life, but their attitude about the surrounding semi-arid mountains and desert is very much more exploitative than our view here as Northeasterners. There's a lot about how much density of population and how much chance when you start exploiting that you're going to overexploit the surrounding area that has to do with how many people there are that you are doing this in conjunction with.
I mean, a lot of scientists are telling us, I mean, we're at a tipping point right now. We may have already crossed it. Nina mentioned that we live by a river that floods. The river floods a lot more these days than it used to. And a lot of people have said that's due to climate change. You don't think so?
No. The biggest flood on this river was in 1936. That's been almost 100 years now. The second biggest one was in 1889. That's been a long time. 1972 was the last really huge flood. So it's been an ongoing process for a long time.
So this brings me back to a question that I have for Ellen, and the sort of the narrative of climate change and science and the kind of culture wars over all of that. What is the role of this kind of biblical exploration about environmentalism and religion in the broader contemporary debates about climate change and environmental science?
You mean who's talking about this? What I'm talking about?
I think yes, and how can this angle, this approach that sort of draws on religious tradition, help people understand what the science is about? Or are people going to say, science is very separate from religion, and you can't, be informed by one or the other? Or, so I'm just wondering, if where you see.
Well, okay, so let me just say, like, kind of the motivation for me around why I spend all my time doing this. Two very primary reasons. I always thought, and perhaps naively, okay, because I started Shomer Adamah a long time ago, but I always thought that if we could read the Bible ecologically, we being not just Jews, but Christians and Jews, that we would be able to mobilize people across, across denominations, across the world. I mean, this was my vision from 35 years ago. And yes, I think it was naive, but that's what motivated me. I really believed that I love doing interfaith work, and I love having texts as a way to do interfaith work and to have a shared biblical text. And I just find that
lock the door.
I find that really illuminating for in interfaith settings. I've never worked in the South or with a lot of, conservative congregations, but that was my motivation, number one. And number two, my other motivation is because for me, I came up learning this stuff in college and seeing how dominion is taught in college and how alienated young people become towards religion. You know, for me, I'm trying to heal the divide between religion and secular. You know, that's a big motivation for me. And I've just always felt like we could come together around the natural world. So
Thank you.
And I liked your idea also when you talked about celebrating Shabbat and taking the time to rest and maybe to see the world around us.
can I just respond to that a little bit?
Yes.
So actually, there's a project that I'm involved with called the Green Sabbath Project, which was started by a friend of mine who's a professor of Jewish studies in Berlin. His name is Jonathan Schorsch. And it's an interfaith. The idea is that the idea is about Sabbath as a universal day of rest. So Jonathan's vision is that we should all be celebrating some day of rest. Like for Muslims, it would be a different day of the week. But that, you know, that's the motivating vision for him, is to get us all to stop one day a week and to feel what that feels like and to come back with a renewed vision, right? And I feel like there's tremendous potential in this whole Green Sabbath idea, but as an organization, it's not really grounded, you know what I mean? They don't have any money and blah, 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 but but I think it's got, so it doesn't have legs yet, but it's a great idea.
Well, I hate to have to end this discussion because it's really interesting, and I think we've covered a lot of ground, but there's so much more to say. Unfortunately, we did promise that we would finish up by 8 o'clock. So thank you so much, Ellen, Paul, Nina. This has been fantastic, and it's given me a lot of ideas, and I hope everybody else has some new ideas and new ways of thinking about it. Let's see. If you've got questions for folks who had questions, we did not have time to get to them, obviously, but I'm hoping that you did send them in the chat to Rebecca. We're going to send them on to our speakers and they will give you some answers, and then we will get those back to you. Also, you will be getting a short survey, so please do fill it out so that we know what worked for you and what didn't, because that way these talks are going to keep getting better. And speaking about these talks, we have another program coming up. Our next program is Jewish Ethics and War, and it is set for 7 p.m. on Tuesday, March the 8th. And that one is going to feature Rabbi Michael Broid of Emory University. And the panelists are going to be Professor Michael Nyberg, who is the Chair of War Studies at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, and Rabbi Ilan Pardo, who's from the Sons of Israel congregation in Chambersburg. And we really do hope to see you then. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you again, everybody.
It has.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank
you
you.
all.
Thank you all.
Nice to
Have a
spend
good
time with
evening.
you.
You too. Thank you.